Hi everyone, I'm Daniela James and I'm reading to you from Toronto, chapter 42 of Jane of Lantern Hill. Jane left Toronto Wednesday night. On Friday night, she reached the island. The train whirled over the sodden land. Her island was not beautiful now. It was just like every other place in the ugliness of very early spring. The only beautiful things were the slim white birches on the dark hills. Jane had sat bolt upright all the time of her journey, night and day, subsisting on what ginger snaps she could force herself to swallow. She hardly moved, but she felt all the time as if she were running, trying to catch up with someone on a road, someone who was getting further ahead all the time. She did not go on to Charlottetown. She got off at West Trent, a little siding where the train stopped when it was asked to. It was only 5 miles from there to Lantern Hill. Jane could hear plainly the roar of the distant ocean. Once she would have thrilled to it. That sonorous music coming through the windy, dark, grey night on the old North Shore. Now she did not notice it. It had been raining, but it was fine now. The road was hard and rough and dotted with pools of water. Jane walked through them unheedingly. Presently there were dark spires of fir trees against a moonrise. The puddles on the road turned to pools of silver fire. The houses she passed seemed alien, remote, as if they had closed their doors to her. The spruces seemed to turn cold shoulders on her. Far away, over the pale moonlit landscape, was a wooded hill with the light of a house she knew on it. Would there be a light at Lantern Hill, or would Dad be gone? A dog of her acquaintance stopped to speak to her, but Jane ignored him. Once a car bumped past her, picking her out with its lights and splashing her from head to foot with mud. It was Joe Weeks, who, being a cousin of Mrs. Meade, had the family trick of malapropisms, and told his skeptical wife when he got home that he had met either Jane Stewart or her operation on the road. Jane felt like an apparition. It seemed to her that she had been walking forever, must go on, walking forever, through this ghostly world of cold moonlight. There was little Donald's house with a light in the parlor. The curtains were red, and when they were drawn at night, the light shone rosily through them. Then Big Donald's light, and at last the lane to Lantern Hill. There was a light in the kitchen! Jane was trembling as she went up the rutted lane and across the yard, past the forlorn and muddy garden where the poppies had once trembled in silken delight, to the window. What a sadly different homecoming from what she had planned. She looked in. Dad was reading by the table. He wore his shabby old tweed suit and the nice grey tie with tiny red flecks in it which Jane had picked out for him last summer. The old contemptible was in his mouth, and his legs were cocked up on the sofa where 2 dogs and First Peter were sleeping. Silver Penny was stretched out against the warm base of the gasoline lamp on the table. In the corner was a sinkful of dirty dishes. Even at that moment, a fresh pang tore Jane's heart at the sight. A moment later, an amazed Andrew Stewart looked up to see his daughter standing before him, wet-footed, mud-splashed, white-faced, with her eyes so terribly full of misery that a hideous fear flashed into his mind. Was her mother? Good heavens, Jane! Literally sick from fear, Jane bluntly put the question she had come so far to ask. "Father, are you going to get a divorce and marry Miss Morrow?" Dad stared at her for a moment. Then, "No!" he shouted. And again, "No, no, no! Jane, who told you such a thing?" Jane drew a breath, trying to realize that the long nightmare was over. She couldn't, not at first. Aunt Irene wrote me. She said you were going to Boston. She said, Irene. Irene is always getting silly notions in her head. She means well, but Jane, listen once for all. I'm the husband of one wife, and I'll never be anything else. Dad broke off and stared at Jane. Jane, who never cried, was crying. He swept her into his arms. Jane, you darling little idiot, how could you believe such stuff? I like Lillian Morrow. I've always liked her. And I could never love her in 1,000 years. Going to Boston? Of course I'm going to Boston. I've great news for you, Jane. My book has been accepted after all. I'm going to Boston to arrange the details with my publishers. Darling, do you mean to tell me that you walked from West Trent? How lucky I hung a moon out. But you were just sopping. What you need is a brew of good hot cocoa, and I'm going to make it for you. Look, pleasant dogs. Purr, Peter. Jane has come home.